Welcome to the Femsplainers. I'm Danielle Crittenden, broadcasting from my Canadian studio. And in my Canadian studio this week with me is David Frum, our favorite mansplainer. And you'll be co-splaining with me today with our guest, Ann Applebaum.
Now, admit it, the only reason I'm here is because I'm your only co-splainer who get a visa to cross the Canadian border.
It's true. We've been quarantining together for 2 weeks. It's amazing we're still able to sit next to each other and speak to each other.
But we got quite an interrogation. When we
tell people what if first of all, they're not letting in Americans. We're in Canada. The Canadians have closed the border to Americans.
Yes. So we're here because we're both born Canadian citizens, right. and so we're allowed to cross.
Right. But we got interrogated.
Well, we came in two separate cars.
Right.
So we each got different kinds of questions. You got asked about the dogs.
Barely. Well, what they do is they're not just. I thought they'd be more worried. I was more worried about proving I was a Canadian citizen. But what they really wanted to know that you were able to, wherever you were headed to stay there for 2 weeks, not leave the property, have all your supplies, and she saw the big 2 labs in the back seat and said, "And how do you plan to walk your dogs?" And I'm thinking, or no, she said, "And what about the dogs?" And I thought, wow, she's worried about them and they're quarantining. And then she goes, "No, how are you going to walk them?" And I said, "Oh, it's okay. We're in the middle of nowhere. They'll be able to run around."
Well, that's a little insulting. We're not in the middle of nowhere. We're in the middle of Prince Edward County, Ontario. But there is room where a dog can be a dog. And I got asked about groceries. How are you going to be fed? And I had groceries in the truck.
You said, "I have a wife." That's my wife's problem, not mine, madam.
But no, there's search, and we are now out of quarantine, and we went for the first time to a public place here. And as we stepped in, my temperature was taken. I got a little. This
is our local restaurant. Yeah.
They put a beeping device on my forehead to take my temperature to confirm that I had no symptoms. And there is something about this that is suddenly quite first world, that you think people are taking problems seriously. They're applying advanced technology like thermometers. and people are, I don't think it's fun for anybody, but people are being responsible.
Well, it feels weirdly like pandemic normal, that This is in places where, this will happen, we hope, in the States, where places where it gets sort of under control. It gets very natural to wear a mask. You enter a grocery store, you wear a mask, there's hand sanitizer, they sanitize the carts, and you just go about your business. And in certain stores and smaller stores, they'll control it. But they're now opening restaurants in all of the province of Ontario where we are, except Toronto.
Yeah, the big city's different.
But it does feel quite normal, except for the fact that you have to wear a mask. And there have been no cases in our area for a while.
Well, and we are speaking, I think, the day after the Centers for Disease Control of the United States released a study. There was a hairdressing salon in Springfield, Missouri, where 2 workers, 2 hairstylists, worked even though they had symptoms. And maybe I'm sure there's a story to that, and maybe it wasn't as malevolent as it sounds.
Like continuing to work when you have symptoms.
But they did, and when it was traced, they came into contact with 139 customers. But the store had enforced masking. Both the 2 hairstylists and the 139 customers had all been wearing masks, and the result was, although the 2 hairstylists did get quite sick, they were sick before they started work. None of the 139 people they came into contact with got sick. So, moral of the story is, if everyone will wear masks, you can really put this behind you quite quickly. So let's just do it.
Yeah, no, it's and there are people who object to wearing masks up here, but they're in the minority, and they don't pull out a gun at the Walmart. They just get denied entry and they have to go away. But
it goes. I think it's a product of both the best and the worst quality in the Canadian character, which, as with most of us, our best and worst qualities are the same qualities at different times. And the Canadian character is, you put a plate of peas in front of them and say, "Here are peas, eat them." And the Canadian will say, "I don't like peas." And you say, "You have to eat them." And he'll say, "Okay, then."
They don't say, "Making me eat peas is against my constitutional right."
bang, bang, you're dead.
No, they didn't.
Ate the peas.
And also, by the way, David, they do check up on us. We've received calls, and I said, what if my phone, I have a Canadian phone, but what if my phone didn't work up here as if I use my American phone? And they said, well, we'd have to send the RCMP to check on you. Imagine this Mountie coming down our driveway. And we always get our men. But anyway, all right. Well, we're here this week. This is part of our summer series, summer author series. And we are interviewing our friend, the historian, Pulitzer Prize winning historian, Anne Applebaum. She has just written a book called Twilight of Democracy, The Seductive Lure of Authoritarianism. And we're going to unpack that title because it's...
You have omitted to mention the most important book.
Oh, no, I was going to get to that book, but I wanted to preview that this is going to be a conversation a lot about friendships in this contrarian age. But before we get to that, yes, I always forget to do this when Anne comes on, is plug the cookbook we wrote together,
yes,
which is called From a Polish Country House Kitchen. I think it's like 99, what is it? It's right behind me. 99 recipes of the ultimate comfort food. Great summer recipes. We wrote it in Poland together. And David, just let's plug all the books. You are also an author, and your book is Trumpocalypse, Restoring American Democracy. And we had you on when it came out in May. Right.
And Trumpocalypse is, I think, it's important for two things. First is it is a guide to what comes next in American life. And second, it's a very useful sobriety test when the police pull you over, so they can hold up a copy of the book and say, what's the title? And if you, and if you can pronounce it, you can drive on. Exactly. I'll have those keys from you, man.
But also, one of the reasons I wanted to have you co-splaining today, David, not just because you're the only one handy in this rural Canadian area, but this is, as we said, it's a book about friendships in this politically partisan time. And you and Anne, me too, but you and Anne more as public, can I call you public intellectuals, public conservative intellectuals?
Smile when you say that.
Intellectuals. You've had this conservative journey, as it were, together, where you were part of the movement in the 80s and Reaganism, and you have, I mean, you're very similar in this way, that you have both traversed an intellectual path that has found you both separated, and many others, like now called never Trumpers for, I don't like that phrase, but who find themselves not in harmony with where not just conservatism or republicanism has gone in the United States, but around free democracies around the world.
Right. Well, Anne and I have known each other since the middle 80s. We both went to Yale, but not together. I was significantly older, and I'm going to with the passing of the years, I will increase the increment of that degree of age. But we didn't overlap as classmates. But her reputation, even after I graduated, her reputation in that community was very large. And what we had in common was when we were there, obviously most people understood that the Soviet Union was not a nice place to live. But the idea that you would study the Soviet Union in the same way and for the same reasons that you would study Nazi Germany, and that they were reflective of the same kind of human oppression and degradation and mass murder, that was a controversial idea. And there was a network of professors and a few students who took the idea seriously. I had studied with those people beforehand, but Anne took it that one more step, where she actually then went to Central and Eastern Europe to live, mastered the languages, and really threw herself not just as a scholar of communism, but also into the work of helping to hasten the overthrow of communism. And she married a Pole, Roddick Sikorski, who went on to a distinguished career as a foreign minister and defense minister of Poland, but who at the time when, of the 80s was living in England as a political refugee because he had to leave Poland when the communist government there cracked down on the Solidarity movement in December of 1981 and sent everyone who had been involved with Solidarity, as he had been as a student, fleeing or facing the choice of flee or go to prison. So we are that cohort that was inspired by Ronald Reagan, inspired by Margaret Thatcher, thrilled in 1989, 1990, and thought that the path of the world would be one way, and it's been a different one. And what is important about this book, and you and I are in this together with Anne, is it is about the person. Okay, as those dreams have tarnished, mm-hmm. How do we make personal sense of this? We have people in our lives who seem to us to have turned their backs on the values we shared. I'm sure we seem the same way to them. We get this all the time. What happened to you? You're not a good conservative. You're not being true. You're keeping company with all of those
liberal cocktail party
elites, and they find it absurd that I think Donald Trump is a menace, and I find it absurd that they think these 100 art students in Portland are a menace to the United States.
Well, let's not get into that, because there are people getting killed in that dumb commune that they set up, yes. and rejected police. But that's not going back to Anne. But these friendships, and we face them in our own lives, everyone in our families, yeah. Where, what happened to Uncle so-and-so, yeah. Or Uncle so-and-so is saying, what happened to you? And Anne's book really it both explores that and gives us a way to think of that. So let's bring her on and talk about some of our old ex-friends, maybe. And by the way, if you're enjoying the conversation, please consider supporting us on Patreon or Glow. We really, really need your support, especially during these times. And past couple of weeks, everybody's been stepping up. $1 a month, $2 a month, $5 a month. Very grateful. It will keep the podcast and these conversations going. That's patreon.com/femsplainers and glow.fm/femsplainers. Thank you. And let's bring on Anne. Again to the Femsplainers. So happy to see you again. I mean, you were on just very recently. You were on like a month ago. So as co-splainers.
Yes, we were on. Yes, a few weeks ago
with Emily St. John Mandel talking about pandemics. But
that's correct.
We've talked a little bit about the book, David and I, before you came on. But just give us a quick summary of it and what moved you to write it? Because, of course, among other things, it's much shorter than many of your other books. It's maybe the thinnest book.
Indeed. I mean, so, to date, the history books that I write involve spending many years in archives, collecting lots of facts, putting them together into a narrative. Sometimes that takes many years. Showing a story from different points of view, looking at it from the, whether it's the Gulag, from the prisoner's point of view, from Stalin's point of view, and so on. This book is exactly the opposite of that. So this is a very personal book. I make clear that I have a set of biases. This is my point of view on events that happened over the last 10 and 20 years. It really started with, it really did start the way the book starts. In other words, it started with me thinking back on a New Year's Eve party that I gave in 1999, which I have a feeling both of you were in fact invited to.
We were.
Made the mistake of not coming.
We still are huge regrets that we were unable to get to Poland in January.
we have
That's
been to
right. Well, many people felt that. Anyway, it was not a fancy party. It was quite a scruffy party in many ways. But what I reflected on 20 years later was how many of the people who were at it were no longer my friends. And there were one or two in particular who puzzled me. And I started to think about what were the things that had changed, what had altered in politics, what had altered in the world that meant that, and the party is a metaphor. Okay, this is not a book about parties. It's about who are your alliances and who are you allied to in politics, and whose team do you feel you're on at one point in history, and how come that changes at another point in history? And the team that I was on, in 1989 and the 1990s and all the way up to 1999 was a team that I felt were I would describe them broadly as center-right anti-communists. So in Poland, these were people who'd been in the opposition. We were the younger members of the opposition, actually. So these aren't necessarily leaders of the opposition, in the anti-communist opposition, I should say, in the previous years. In the US and the UK, they were also people who were anti-communists. They were center-right. You might have called us free marketeers at that time, although I don't think economics was the driving inspiration. You might have called us classical liberals. You might have, some of the British ones, you might have called them Thatcherites. You might have called the Americans Reaganites. Anyway, it felt to me like a single group. And the party, which was mostly Poles and sort of, ranging from friends of ours, journalists from Warsaw, Roddick's cousins, my husband's cousins, plus a few foreigners, was that group of people, or that was what unified them. And it felt at the time like a solid group. Okay, then as I fast forward to the present, certainly if you look at the polls, a chunk of the people who were there are now not just, it's important to understand that these are journalists and intellectuals. They are really the thinkers and spin doctors and creators of the current Polish ruling party, which is a nativist nationalist party. Just to give you a little flavor of the kind of rhetoric they use, they just won a presidential election, although it was very close. And the central theme of the election campaign was, and this is the president's, the sitting president's language, LGBT, a word that sounds very strange in Polish because it's an English acronym. Mm-hmm. And he talked about the threat of LGBT, and he said, LGBT is not people, it's an ideology, and it's an ideology worse than communism. That was a part of his campaign. Another part of the campaign was an attempt to show his opponent, who's the mayor of Warsaw, as someone who answers to foreign and especially Jewish masters. We don't really know if he's really Polish. And the messaging of the campaign was to create the sense that we are the real Poles, and to underline this division in Poland. We're the Poles; those are the foreigners, the outsiders. They're somehow unpatriotic traitors. And I have friends who are part of that messaging, or people that I know. I wouldn't say they're my friends, but or people who I know who engage in that messaging, take part in it. Are happy to make anti-Semitic references in public television and in election campaigns. And so the question is, what happened to those people? Were they always like that, or did they change? And the book goes through that same answer, looks at that same kind of question from several different angles. So I talk about my British friends, who at that time were also, as I said, Thatcherites. Many of them are now leading Brexiteers, including Boris Johnson, who was a journalist colleague, also in the 1990s. I look a little bit at Americans. I focus on someone who's not a close friend of mine, but whom I did know and was kind of generally in my circle. And of course, you both know very well, Laura Ingraham. And I look also at Spain, which is, again, not a country that I am, as deeply involved in, but where where you can also trace a similar process. And the book looks both at people, and it looks at some historical echoes of these changes. And there's a bit of reporting. There are people whom I interview and so on. And it looks for an explanation, and there isn't a single explanation. And so for political scientists, it's going to be a very annoying book. There isn't a kind of grand thesis that I proclaim and that you can argue with in an easy way. In fact, the book is quirky enough that my American publishers and my British publishers had a big fight over what the title should be. And the title, which is Twilight of Democracy, which not everybody liked, but the truce was that the subtitles are different. So the American title is Twilight of Democracy, The Seductive Lure of Authoritarianism, and the British title is Twilight of Democracy, The Failure of Politics and the Parting of Friends. And those do sound quite different. And that's because those are two two aspects of the book. So part of the book is about the lure of authoritarianism, why it's attractive to some people, and part of the book is about the failure of politics and the parting of friends. I mean, I should say you are both in the book, so maybe we should,
but
you know,
we're
make
still
clear
friends,
there's
right? Spoiler alert, we're still friends. What happened to Daniel and David?
That's right. They drove north of the border and were never seen again, except this giant ice sculpture. Winter set in.
No, I mean, and I should also say that most of the people whom I was friends with 20 years ago, I'm still friends with. So it's not like I lose all my friends. You know, one of the reviews also had a line, because I also end the book on a party, just again as a kind of metaphor. And somebody said, well, she's still having parties, but the guest list is a lot shorter. No, you know, it's the same length guest list. It's just different people on.
Well,
but no, it's really looking at the alteration in, you know, the changes of political configuration, particularly on the center right, that have taken place over the last 3 decades.
Well, I wanted to bookend that wonderful summary with the story of another party, which was in October 2017, a book party that we had for you that was cited in an article about you by that appeared in GQ by Sam Tannenhouse. And one of the striking things is the guest list, it wasn't any shorter, it was just radically different. And Sam noted that there are a lot of people there who would not have been there 10 years ago. And there are a lot of people who weren't there who would have been there 10 years ago.
And this is sort of more liberal, quote unquote, than conservative.
Right, because one of the things that is also a sub-theme of your book is our friends change, the world changed, but we also change. Everything changes. And that the experiences of the past, of the most recent past, have driven us to places where we didn't think we would be.
I mean, that's absolutely true. I mean, you know, the issues that you and I have had this conversation, I think, you know, that things that wouldn't have interested me or wouldn't have bothered me much, or I didn't care that much about, or I didn't see the point of. I mean, for example, like LGBT rights, which wasn't in the front of my agenda 10 or 15 years ago, I've come to see as actually quite crucial and quite critical because of the way they've been manipulated and used by people whom I think are doing it for the wrong reasons and are doing it in a divisive way. And change of circumstances has also meant that issues look differently in the light of time, and that's normal. David, I think you were the one who pointed me also, and this is in the book, to this fantastic phenomenon that's described in Marcel Proust's famous, very, very long novel, in which he also talks about. There's a point in the novel where he talks about the Dreyfus trial, which is another sub-theme in my book. And how all the parties in Paris are, you know, there's a political division that's created. People who are pro and anti-Dreyfus. Dreyfus this is a famous case of a French army officer who was wrongly accused of having been a traitor, and he was Jewish, and there was a big burst of anti-Semitism washed over Paris, and eventually some people began to defend him, and he was eventually brought back and pardoned and so on. But this caused great divisions, political divisions and social divisions. And then in the final volume of the series, the narrator comes back to Paris and discovers that these bitter divisions that the Dreyfus years had evoked had somehow melted away, and the divisions had recast themselves. And now the First World War had happened, and people found themselves on different sides. You know, events had made people seek different alliances. So this is nothing unique to our time or to our society.
Yeah.
Well, let's put some names to this so people can sort of see it in a more personal way. You mentioned Laura Ingraham, but let's talk about Tucker Carlson, because Tucker was someone who used to come to our parties. He was a colleague of yours at the Weekly Standard back in the day.
Well, we don't literally live in Georgetown, but when Tucker was inveighing on one of his shows about Georgetown cocktail parties, someone we both knew said, "That's weird, because the one and only time I ever met Tucker Carlson was at a cocktail party at David Frum's house." And as I say, it's not literally Georgetown, but it's
like a mile north.
It's about a mile north. Right, but I have this joke. I mean, I have this joke that is maybe a little sharper than I should tell, but I should say, I really liked Weimar Tucker. The new Tucker, I'm not so sure about, but the Weimar era version is very charming.
Let's describe him. You see, so I remember he came to one of our annual holiday parties. He was a product of the same. So his father ran American broadcasting into the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. His father had been a well-known journalist, and he became then head of that entity that runs Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and so absolutely a product of those anti-communist struggles. And Tucker, the family was very well off. Tucker was expensively educated and belonged to that world, came into the Weekly Standard, where he was a really, really good magazine writer, wrote other kinds of magazine pieces. I think I blurbed his first book. And in the early 2000s, but he loved TV. And another mutual friend of ours, Christopher Hitchens, used to warn him against this, the way you might warn off someone from cocaine. It's seductive, it's lucrative, it's dangerous. Yeah. And then, but he kept trying it and failing at it and trying it and failing at it. And then finally he found the formula that worked. And what I think about him, there's in Richard Rovere's biography of Joe McCarthy, he tells this story that Rover, I never know how to pronounce his name, had been a journalist who'd covered McCarthy closely. And McCarthy was kind of a raffish, if you got to know him, he was actually kind of fun to be around. He was sort of raffish. He told dirty stories. And McCarthy and Rovere's wife had also liked Joe McCarthy a fair bit, against her, and despised everything he was doing, but couldn't help but be engaged with him. And he came home and found his wife very, very upset. And she just heard on the radio that Joe McCarthy had died. And the announcer, looking for something to say positive about the recently dead, said, McCarthy, he was a controversial figure, loved by some, hated by many, but whatever else you have to say about him, at least he was sincere. And the wife said, don't they understand, the one thing you could never say about him was that he was sincere. It wasn't that he didn't believe it, is that he didn't care whether he believed it or not. I think when I watched, Tucker would, if animal rights were the formula for Fox News' survival as a business, he would be for animal rights. Unfortunately, if it was in Poland and anti-Semitism was the secret of success, he would be for that. If being pro-LGBT was the key. Can we have the Q? They seem to have dropped the Q in Poland.
It must sound weird. It must sound super weird in Polish.
I just noticed in Poland the Q doesn't exist. Sorry, go on.
No, that we don't know what the Q means in Poland. LGBT doesn't make any sense in Polish either, I should say. It's like, what? It's a weird acronym. So.
Right.
But we have, and so one of the, he raises this question, which is is the people you talk about, the people we know, you can divide them between those who believe it and those who don't, between the fanatics and the crooks. And it's kind of the fanatics and the cynics. And if they go to work in the White House, they become crooks. And it's kind of a complicated moral question. Which are worse, the people who believe it or the people who don't?
Yes. I mean, and in my book, they're both. I mean, there are, there are people who, this is a concept that I tried to tease out. There are people who are, I believe, people on the right who are genuinely despairing about the state of modern culture, and who really do believe that it's degraded, that our societies are divided. They are degenerate. Whether for some it's sexually degenerate, for some it's the too rapid demographic change. For some people, it's the influence of global capitalism. I mean, even people on the right, the family is disappearing. Small towns are losing their appeal. In England, a lot of it's about the countryside. The countryside is losing its traditional look. And one of the people, for example, that I write about in the book, and this is somebody who I believe to be extremely sincere. And I quote from a very powerful book he wrote called England and Elegies, because Roger Scruton, who's a really great, probably the greatest conservative philosopher in Britain in the last several decades, and who was genuinely despairing. So he wrote a book called England and Elegy, which he describes as a funeral oration for my society. In other words, England is dead, and cannot be revived. And then the book describes this Englishness which has been lost. And I think he's someone who sincerely felt that. I don't doubt that. He was also not a politician. He was not a spin doctor or a journalist. He was not a Tucker Carlson. But I do think that his sincerity, was something that was real. So people and other people felt this, that some kind of society was disappearing. And then there are other insincere people, opportunists, who leap on these deeper feelings and seek to manipulate them, and whether it's as Tucker Carlson does in order to get a job on Fox or to make his program the most watched television, show on cable TV, or whether it's people who seek to create a political party based on, this sense of disorientation that people have, which is to do with modernity and rapidly changing technology and so on. So then there are people who manipulate these deeper sentiments. But maybe Laura Ingraham is one who is worth bringing up. So I do talk about her in the book. She's someone who I do not know well, but I know some people who know her. And she's someone who I think probably is sincere, or at least a portion of what she does is sincere, and that she's somebody who does feel that America's degenerate, that the wrong elite is in power, that the people who run most governments and most universities, she talks a lot about the left, the Dems, universities all being a kind of a single interchangeable group. Mm-hmm. And she thinks they shouldn't be in charge, whatever in charge means, given that they're not in charge. It's a strange, but I think at some level, of course, she's also somebody who has, thanks to the Trump administration, has got a primetime slot on Fox, which she didn't have before. So she's a beneficiary of this new wave of American nationalism. But also at some level, I think she believes it, or she believes that there is a real threat to America coming from rioters in Portland. But maybe you disagree. Actually, you all know her better than I do.
Well, she has been a very, very good friend of ours for many, many years. And when Trump happened, we've drifted apart. But I think what you're saying is interesting, that it's almost like, I don't know, we're looking at different sides of a looking glass, mm-hmm. that those, and we have other friends, I think, because of their religious beliefs, for all the things you said, don't like Trump, but they prefer him or will accept him just in order not to have the other side in power. Because it's not to say that, what happened in Portland isn't scary, that radicals and activists on all sides are always scary. But I guess, what is it in you that makes one side scarier than the other, and therefore willing to say, well, Trump may have many flaws, but, at least he's getting the right judges and blah, blah, blah.
Well, this takes the question of the Harper's letter that has been so controversial. I want to get back to our friends in a minute, but one of the things that I
explain what the Harper's letter is too.
So about 150 writers, academics, intellectuals, and you were one, I was another, signed a letter that was organized by a core group whose names are not germane for the moment, to protest.
Thomas Chatterton Williams,
George Packer, to raise a voice of protest against some recent events, mostly on the American liberal left, where people who had said or done something that was not consistent with the latest trends in liberal left thought found themselves losing jobs, being forbidden to speak, punished in various kinds of ways that went beyond criticism, but actually attacks on people's livelihoods, attacks on people's ability to belong to institutions they had belonged to. And I'm not on the liberal left, obviously. And I had complicated feelings about that letter, because one of the things I've noticed is which of these dangers that Danielle alluded to rate first. A lot depends on, as always, where you are. So if you're in a university, if you're in an American corporation with an active HR department,
activist HR department,
you can feel Trump is far away, The threat of right-wing authoritarianism is far away. Meanwhile, you are being hauled into a re-education class where your family's livelihood, it's your family's subsistence in the face of this terrible economic crisis depends on your willingness to repeat dogmas that you find untrue. But if you don't repeat the dogmas, you'll lose your job. And people find that very threatening. Then those of us who are not in that situation say, this sounds like, yes, this is, if you were on a campus, this is very annoying. But meanwhile, the fundaments of the American Constitution and the World Trading System and the Western World Order, all of those are under attack. I can add maybe a personal note, which is the one time in my life that I was ever canceled. It was from a right-wing institution, not a left-wing one.
Well, let me maybe ask. Sorry, Anne. I would maybe on that react to that, but also a question for both of you is why don't you react to these left-wing so-called threats? Like, what is it about you and Anne that are not more upset in the way that maybe under Reagan, when you would be more reactive to a lot of things that would be lumped in the leftist or democratic bracket that just don't seem to bug or scare you as much anymore, and thus gives the friends who are worried about it a kind of mystification of why don't you care, but why aren't you more bothered? But maybe, Anne, you answer that.
So I mean, part of it for me, so I live in Europe and, it's, as David said, I'm not in a university or actually a news organization where this is a constant presence or problem. All of my dealings with American undergraduates, which have been more recently, I've been involved at Johns Hopkins University, have been overwhelmingly positive in the sense that they all seem very open and unideological. And so, it's not, I feel it's awkward for me to comment on a sort of situation that I don't have any direct knowledge of. I mean, I can read about it in the newspapers. Whereas my involvement and understanding and knowledge of the authoritarian and nationalist right is very direct and personal. I feel it around me. I see it all the time. I know the people. And so that feels like something I'm able to talk about more. There's also a big difference between, we're talking about the difference between people in power and people out of power. The damage that the authoritarian, Republicans have done by being in charge of the United States over the last 3 years seems to me so overwhelming and so terrifying that for me, the priority has to be to focus on having a change. I mean, by the way, not only a change of president, but also a change within that party. It's very important that America has a conservative party which is decent and well run, and run by upstanding moral people who care about the United States, and that it isn't a corruption racket for a family or a group of lobbyists. And so I very much hope that the Republican Party will be saved. But if you look at the way the party behaves, whether you look at the voter suppression tactics, the attempts to make sure that people have difficulty voting, which is, by the way, about to be a huge issue coming up in the fall. The gerrymandering, the lying, the attacks on nonpartisan and bipartisan institutions. Whether it's the FBI and the CIA or judges or the media. The constant attempt to undermine people's trust in institutions that are really necessary to our society. I mean, these seem to me such huge and terribly damaging efforts that, my effort has been focused on that. Whereas so far, these arguments that the left-wing arguments inside university, the emergence of this illiberal left-wing ideology that insists people speak a certain way about race and about gender. That seems to me something that, first of all, it's been mostly up until now fairly fringe, and it doesn't even affect most universities, and it doesn't affect most kids at most universities. You can dodge this issue completely if you're a chemical engineering major, and most of this has seemed focused on a small group of kids. I mean, I also tend to think that as it moves into the mainstream, as we've seen over the last few weeks, as it moves into newspapers and maybe corporate HR departments, I do think that the pushback against it will begin to be larger. I mean, even in just the last kind of 3 weeks, there have been critiques of this Robin DiAngelo book, which is full of this sort of nonsense about almost kind of racist discussion of racism, about what Black people are and what white people are. I mean, you're beginning to see really good criticism of that appearing. And I sort of feel like this ideology will eventually fall apart. Once we defeat Trump and once we have a Republican Party which speaks for conservative American values, I'll be happy to join in with that. I mean, of course, I agree with it. It's hard for me to see it as the biggest threat to the world right now. I don't know, David, how do you feel?
I agree with everything you've said. I would add a couple of things to it. First, an anecdote. I have a friend who had an important job on the Hillary Clinton campaign in 2016, and he attended a number of focus groups with working class Democrats, exactly the kind of people whom Hillary Clinton so devastatingly and crucially lost in 2016. And again, the issue that would come up, especially among the women, was political correctness. And he struggled. What are they talking about? They're not on a university campus. They don't work in media organizations. And he gradually understood that what these women were saying is, there is this new upper class etiquette about how to speak about certain things that is constantly changing. We never understood it round one, but if we ever did understand it, they changed the rules again. And one of these days, my husband is going to make a joke in the fire hall or in the construction, and he's going to lose his job, and our family is going to be ruined because some upper class person, fancy education, said your husband's joke is a firing offense, and it was almost like a form of class tyranny over them, and maybe they exaggerated in their minds how real this threat was, but they really did experience it. So something important is going on here. And it also blocks, as we saw on this broadcast 2 weeks ago, that there's this new identification of people with this problem of gender dysphoria, strongly feeling that they don't belong in their bodies. And this raises a lot of scientific and psychological and medical questions, but instead there is now this brute attempt to decide it by political power and intimidation, where the doctors who know most about it are precisely those who are not allowed to speak about it because they might say the wrong thing.
Oh, indeed, are getting removed from their posts.
Yeah, so that's an important but boutique issue. I think one of the other reasons I would say with Anne, I mean, obviously, I agree with everything you said about why this seems. I mean, a malign president of the United States is a bigger problem than a weak president of Yale. And at the moment, we seem to have both. And I wish we had a less weak president of Yale, and I wish we had a less malign president of the United States. But if I'm given only one wish, I'm going to choose for a less malign president of the United States over a less weak president of Yale. But I think there's a last thing that is going on, which is, as Anne said, this is a dynamic discussion. And I'm not sure it's a totally sinister discussion, because as the discussion unfolds, there are things where you have to say, actually, you kind of make a point. I mean, it is insane that the U.S. Army has bases named for Confederate generals. And I always thought that was a weird, ever since I became aware of it, I always thought that was... I didn't even know
it was true. I had no idea there were bases named for Confederate generals. I just didn't know that, General Bragg was a Confederate general. So
right, exactly.
It didn't register in my...
And then you don't think about it much. And then someone draws your attention to it, and you say, yeah, no, that shouldn't happen. That's obvious. And
ridiculous.
And then other things too that people draw your attention to, I can walk past a statue of Stonewall Jackson with a shrug and say, weird that somebody would build that, but other people don't have space and scope to be so casual about it. It feels like a threat to them, so part of what has happened in this dynamic is. And one of the reasons why politics is not going to go back to the way it was before these eruptions is that some of the things that the critics are saying have some validity. I'm right now working on a project that may turn into a book about this whole question of monuments and statues and naming. And it gets more and more complicated. The more you think about it, the more complicated it gets. I keep thinking of something that happened to me. The first time I went to Ukraine. I paid a cab and got some change back. And on the back of one of the notes, there's a picture of a 17th century figure called Chalnitsky. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. I'm sure I'm not. And who turns out, it turns out is a giant hero of Ukrainians, and whom I know because he was the author of the largest massacre of Jewish populations in Europe between the Crusades and the Nazi Holocaust. What? And he's on the money? And so I think, maybe other people have equivalent reactions to that, and that's something I take seriously. So I think it was firing James Bennett at the New York Times was an appalling act of corporate cowardice, and a terrible mistake, and that one that will have consequences for the ability of the New York Times to be a quality paper. But it's not like, and it's something I'm happy to take a stand against, along with other stands that right now seem like the more salient ones.
Yeah, I mean, about the New York Times also, all those New York Times related issues are tough for me because I feel like I don't know the inside story. I'm not inside the New York Times. I don't know exactly what was said by who and so on. So it's but no, I mean, in principle, editors should have some freedom, need to have freedom to think what they want. And also they should have freedom to make mistakes. I mean, one of the other amusing things about the subject is a couple of years ago when Ian Buruma was fired from the New York Review of Books, in slightly different circumstances. He published an article, although some parallels, he published an article that some staff found offensive. It was an article by a Canadian, I believe, journalist who'd been outed for misogyny and attempted rape and other even worse things. Worse. And Ian Buruma thought it would be interesting to have a piece by someone who had lost their job and so on and been effectively canceled. Anyway, he doesn't really matter. That's not what happened. Anyway, he was fired for printing that. And I signed a letter, which was, I would say, had an equally illustrious list of names attached to it. People who contribute to the New Yorker books, literati of all kinds, Harvard professors, poets, and they all signed this letter saying Ian Buruma shouldn't be fired for this reason. And nobody paid the slightest bit of attention to it. It got no notice in the wider press, and it had no impact on the New York Review of Books. So all these grand people, writers and poets and critics, no one cared at all what they said, and they wrote it and it disappeared. And I was really surprised by the reaction to the Harper's letter, that there was this kind of outpouring of interest and emotion and so on about it, because it's not, the language wasn't even that different, and I think some of the names are even the same. And the only conclusion one can have is that these, as the politics change, the salience and the nature of the arguments. I mean, this is back to some of the themes of my book. Some of the ideas that seem irrelevant or silly at one point in history or unimportant reemerged later as very important, or factions or groups of people who are right now dominant and in power, later on won't be in power, and vice versa. So, I mean, we all like to think that politics is, you can have sort of unchanging views that will carry you through your lifetime. But actually, as you say, it's a dynamic, and events change, and new information presents itself. I mean, I do think you can have sort of deeper principles. I mean, you can have moral beliefs which don't change. But in terms of picking sides and who are your allies and what are your views on particular issues, you should be able to change. I mean, absolutely.
Well, let me go back to your American subtitle, The Seductive Lure of Authoritarianism. And I remember when you were writing this book and you would be coming back and forth to teach actually at Johns Hopkins, and we had the just great experience of having you stay with us. And one night we were hashing this over about, you sort of said at the beginning, a taxonomy of why people cotton on to people like Trump and other leaders in the rest of the world. So there's, as you said, the cynicism, which I think we put Tucker Carlson in, the true believers, which we put Laura in. But then as you say, underlying this, this lure of authoritarianism. It is a lure. It's not just identifying politically with someone. It's a real lure that you are seeing sweeping around the world, and that you've captured so wonderfully in basically through friendships and alliances. And what I remember we were talking and saying, like, what is it? What makes someone want? What is the allure of that to even an ordinary person? And then why have you and David been resistant to it? You talked about also having core moral beliefs that kind of guide you as well.
Well, that goes to something that we were talking about just before we talked about the Harper's letter, which is how we assess and judge those of our friends who get caught up in this. And so the part of the allure is ordinary politics. That somebody will say, I strongly believe in something. I strongly want to see judges reverse the Roe v. Wade decision and make abortion no longer a constitutional right. I think that's supreme. I'm prepared to work with some very imperfect instruments in order to get that done. So those people may have not think a lot differently about Donald Trump than you or I or Ann does, but whereas we have a set of issues over here that are so important to us that where he's a threat, they would say, well, he could be useful on the thing I most care about. It's a pragmatic decision. With that, you say, I think you're making even an intellectual error, and I have my own theories about how Trump is not going to serve the causes you believe in, but it doesn't make you a reprehensible person. You're making a prudential decision that is going to turn out to be
I think the
wrong.
Pro-life movement made that decision with Donald Trump.
But I think there's something else that is going on, and this is one of the themes of Ann's book, and this is one of the themes of that discussion. The central fact about Donald Trump is he's a self-pitying bully. He's always screaming at people, and he's always feeling sorry for himself. And I think there are people, especially men, especially men my age who play a lot of golf.
Oh, don't smear the golf players.
But who find this profoundly exciting and liberating. That he allowed we talked at the beginning of this broadcast. We talked about the part of Ontario we are as a place where a dog can be a dog. I mean, that Donald Trump allows jerks to be jerks, and there are some people who are jerks and who just find him the leader of the jerk liberation movement. JLL. and what happens then with those people, even though that you find yourself like looking at somebody and saying, we're not actually having a political disagreement, having a disagreement about something that I find repulsive that you find thrilling.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I wrote about this a little bit in the cover story that I did for The Atlantic a few weeks ago, which was also about, but this was more to do with, why, again, not so much voters or why people vote for Trump, but again, people who collaborate with him. And one of the explanations, again, is that he, all my life, I've been a straight up and down politician. I felt like I had to say what was right. I was very careful what I said in public. I tried not to, make a mistake on television. Here's Donald Trump. He just says whatever comes into his head. He sleeps with porn stars. He says, anything he wants and he gets away with it. Well, isn't that just great? And you can see the Senate Republicans who long to be liberated from the political straitjacket, saying exactly like that. But I think, Danielle, your original question, which is about the lure of authoritarianism, is actually, this is a very deep question. And there have been a lot of people over the last 100 years who've written about it. And I go into just a tiny bit of that in my book, where I talk about, the person who originally came up with there's a concept of the authoritarian personality. So are there certain types of people who are bothered by democracy, who prefer a single leader, who would rather live in a society without all this arguing, and there have been a lot of theorizing about, is there such a person, and so on. And recently, in the last several years, there's a behavioral psychologist who I quote in the book, who has done a lot of studies and who believes that there is, she calls it not an authoritarian personality, but an authoritarian predisposition. So there's some people who are, who prefer simplicity, and they don't like cacophony and noise, and they dislike clashing politics, and They also, the same kinds of people, by the way, also dislike the arrival of foreigners in their neighborhoods, and they don't like, these are people who are bothered often by demographic change as well as that. But one of the arguments of the book is that there are, people who think like that, are a important constituent of any society rather. So if we call it 20%, there's 20% wherever you go, in the United States, in Spain, in France, in Russia, and China, whatever. And the question is, is there a way to reach those people and to organize them and to give them a voice? And I do think that the tactics that the politics that and new forms of communication that have been made possible by the internet have enabled those kinds of people to find one another. And it's been possible to create sort of new political groupings or identities for people who are bothered by complexity in modern society and want everyone else to just shut up, And, they're actually, you can organize these people into groups, you can make them, give them a political party, you can give them a voice, you can give them new ways to communicate and so on. So there is and also, by the way, the founding fathers of America, everybody who's ever written about democracy was aware that such a human personality type existed and that free societies sometimes decline and degenerate and turn into dictatorships. So that was what, Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson were talking about when they were writing a constitution that had checks and balances and various different systems put in place that were meant to protect the ideals of democracy against the inevitable arrival of a dictator. So they assumed that there would be such a person and that there would be an appeal, that some people would find an authoritarian demagogue appealing. One of the mistakes I think that we've all made in the last 20 or 30 years was to ignore this possibility. In other words, that democracy can decline, that we can elect people who then destroy our institutions, that our institutions can degenerate. We've assumed that because we were so successful, because we won the Cold War, because America's the biggest and most successful democracy in history, we thought it would necessarily go on that way forever. And the book, if it has a moral, if it has a thesis, is that we shouldn't assume that there have always been people who find autocracy appealing. There have always been intellectuals and journalists and spin doctors who seek to reach those kinds of people, including some that we know, and that sometimes these movements win, and that it's our kind of task as modern American citizens to make sure they don't win and to argue back against them, whether they come from the right or the left. Right now, I think the worst challenge is from the right. Possible that in the future it could come from the left, but I just don't. I don't see it yet.
When we think about the future, the accident that this authoritarian type arrived in the form of a president who was so inattentive, had such a damaged ego, couldn't accept bad news, means that the Trump presidency has presided over this terrible epidemic, and then the collapse of the American economy. And he's on his way to most likely losing very dramatically in November and taking a lot.
But I don't want anyone listening to assume that will happen.
Yes, you keep doing that, and then I have to keep finding wood to stop it.
We have friends who a couple who drive together and one will goad the other by saying to the other, "I think it's going to be all clear driving from here on." And
nothing could possibly go wrong.
Right. And that's when you
no traffic.
That's when you hit the 20-car pile up.
Yes, please.
So I won't.
Ixnay on the predictions.
I won't be Wally with Steve. But supposing that happens, as you say, the 20% are not going to be there, and the future most likely holds that we're going to be in a world in which these tendencies that have discovered their power, that have found new media where they can connect with one another, are going to remain parts of our lives. They may not control executive power in the way that they have done, but they will continue to be political facts and cultural facts. And many of us will discover that people we thought we shared so much with, actually, one of the literary documents of our time is a play I remember watching a long time ago. I hesitate to go back to it because I'm not sure it'll stand up, but Eugene Ionesco's Rhinoceros. So this is a play that's set in a seaside town in, I guess, Romania. And everything's going on as normal and people are going about the business. And then suddenly outside the windows of the cafe, a giant rhinoceros goes tootling by. And people are a little startled, but they adjust. And gradually, one by one, the people of the town turn into rhinoceroses until only the town drunk is left. And he's not a rhinoceros and can't understand why he can never be a rhinoceros. What's wrong with him that he can't join it? And this is a metaphor for many things. But so we may be able to repel the rhino invasion, but there are always going to be rhinos among us. And they are going to have seductive power over some personalities.
Yeah, but it's also our job to find ways of reaching those people and finding ways. One of the things I am worried about with the Biden campaign is that it will make the mistake that was just made here by the centrist candidate. That it will spend too much time speaking to its own people. It will fail to find ways of reaching into the opposite echo chamber or filter bubble, or whatever you want to call that, and this is why I've written a little bit about recently, and I'm the phenomenon of the Republicans against Trump, who may be who are focused precisely on those people and precisely in that campaign, who are seeking to reach Trump voters who are maybe disappointed with Trump, or Republicans who feel tribally attached to their party and can't bear the idea of voting for a Democrat. I am hoping that at least these ex-Republicans or anti-Trump Republicans will find ways of reaching them, because it's very tempting to just stay inside your own echo chamber and not reach. I mean, that is a way to lose the election.
All right. Well, Anne, thank you for taking this time with us. I just want people to know that Anne is, even though it's much later in Poland, she's going to stay for a few minutes to answer questions from our subscribers, our supporters at Patreon and Glow. And then we have this whole other monthly podcast where you have asked questions of our guests, and you get to hear it, but only if you subscribe and support the podcast. So thank you, Anne, for agreeing to stay for a few minutes extra. And thank you for joining us. And stay around. We'll have a little bit of listener reaction coming up. So, well, that was fascinating.
And so brilliant.
I know, she's so brilliant and brave, really, in this case. Did you have any reaction or further reaction just on maybe the friendship point?
Yeah, I think we do need to keep in mind 63 million Americans voted for Donald Trump. And obviously, millions upon millions of them did so without any bad intent. For the same reason we all make political choices. They weighed their alternatives. They chose what seemed to them the best available option. Maybe they weren't even crazy about that option. And I think with many of the people, even who are closely connected to politics, people we know, I think a lot of people were, again, making trade-offs, trying to make the least bad choice. So we want charity from others. We have to give it. And I want to be clear that some of the harsher judgments that we talk about with some of the people in Anne's book and those we know, that we're talking about a subset of a big population.
Yeah, I mean, what I worry about is, as you say, that they're people with incredibly good intentions, but it also sounds, I fear like we will sound condescending to be sort of suggesting that, we're in the right, we see all of this. Why don't you see it? And to me, with dealing with friends of mine who maybe they don't even support Trump anymore, but they would, never support a Democrat, it's almost like you're looking at the same car accident and you're saying, oh my God, look at the bodies all over the highway. This is terrible. And they're saying, oh, it's not that bad. It could have been much, much worse. It could have been an 18-wheel tractor trailer, rather than a minibus. That's what's weird. It's like you're looking at the same accident, but you are having radically different reactions. And that's the thing that I don't want to say my view is superior or that I'm like totally right. I just find it hard to look at this traffic accident without seeing it as a massive traffic accident.
Well, look, any thinking person has to leave open the possibility, maybe I'm wrong. That's something you always have to take seriously. On the other hand, if you thought you were wrong, you would change your view. You have your view because you weighed it the best you could, and you think, I believe I am right. And I think, especially with some of our conservative friends, and especially with those who are not motivated by some of the angry or resentful feelings that have led the people who
or cynical,
or the more cynical ones, I think sometimes I would say, look, you're just making a bad calculation. You think that you can work past Donald Trump's many human faults to achieve some important thing you care about. And I said to them, be careful, because actually what you're going to find is that once you get the Trump taint on your principles, you're going to be worse off. I think in many ways, America in 2020 is a more left-wing country because of Trump than it would have been without Trump. And
how so?
Well, because what he does is he takes positions that used to be sort of standard issue conservative positions, and people sort of squinted at them, but he attaches his own extra cruelty and his own extra bigotry to them. So we're debating now Confederate flags and Confederate monuments. So many Southern people see the Confederate flag and say, I don't mean anything hostile to anybody about it. I just remember that my great-great-grandfather died under that flag, and it's a symbol of my family's history. And then Donald Trump makes it clear, it's a symbol of racism. I'm racist. I'm from New York. I have nothing to do with the South, but I like it because I'm a giant racist. and he's won, like, in 2016, I think there are many more people today who believe the Confederate flag is a symbol of racism than believed it 4 years ago because Donald Trump won the argument.
And a lot of people didn't even really think about it, just as they didn't realize all those army bases were named after Confederate.
Yeah, I think, and I don't think the Me Too movement would have gotten off the ground in the way that it did without Donald Trump. Look, had Hillary Clinton won in 2016, and then the Harvey Weinstein revelations materialized in 2017. As you've pointed out in the show, that story is way more complicated than it looked in the first hours when you heard about it. And Me Too stories have a lot of complexity because there are millions of men, there are millions of women. Men aren't always wrong, and anyway, right and wrong isn't always the right frame. These things are often very messy. And if Hillary Clinton were president and Bill Clinton were first spouse, a lot of people would have remembered those ambiguities. But now instead we have president grab them by the pussy, and you cannot defend him in any way. There's nothing ambiguous about him. He's just an overbearing sexual predator, and I think a lot of some of the oversimplicity of the first days of Me Too came from people looking at the president saying, there's no defending that guy, and therefore there's no defending any of the other people.
I guess it's the leader setting the tone, and this is what maybe we can take away as what you call sometimes the gifts of Trump, the appreciation, especially now through COVID and through this Black Lives Matter, that when you have someone who is not bringing the country together at the top, it really matters.
Yeah.
It really profoundly affects how we get along and how we handle things. So,
well, maybe there's a way to a coda to this. There's a story around the time that you and I are recording this in the New York Times about the incredible failure of the Trump COVID policy and the terrible example he set. And the final quote in the story is from a senior figure in the federal anti-disease effort, who's just marveling at how Donald Trump managed to make the mask controversial, even though we now know how crucial it is. And this doctor said, well, people follow leaders. And then he paused and corrected himself. He said, people follow those who are supposed to be the leaders.
Yeah. All right, David Frum. Well, we got way more political on this Femsplainer episode than usual.
Yes.
Apologies if anyone is offended. And those of you who want to stay with me for a little bit of listener reaction, go pour yourself another drink. Or a drink if you haven't already had one. And we've got some good reactions to the past episodes, and thank you, David, for joining me in the second bedroom Femsplainer's studio up here in Canada.
I'll join you anywhere.
Thank you. Okay, so we've had a whole bunch of reaction, and I didn't want to go another week without addressing some of it. A lot to the trans episode with Abigail Schreier, some to the last week's on sexual obsession with Daphne Merkin and Megan Daum, and then had a couple of questions about Christina and her absence, which I want to address. And then the last one, and I think I'm going to get our listeners' advice on this one. Somebody basically wants us to start a Femsplainer's dating app. So let me just get to those in order. Okay, so the first one is from Renee, and this came via our email, contact@femsplainers.com. It's Renee. She said, I just want to take a moment to thank you for the episode with Abigail Schreier. I appreciate the topics you cover and the questions you ask on Femsplainers. Because of your show, I've discovered many new authors and ideas, but this episode was so impactful that I just had to reach out to thank you. Well, thank you, Renee. My stepdaughter has a difficult time making friends and ended up settling in with a group that started to announce themselves as trans. Every evening dinner conversation was like watching dominoes fall. She reported yet another in the group declaring new pronouns and gender. She was originally skeptical. Over time, she's become increasingly accepting of it and started getting defensive when my partner and I asked questions trying to understand. After listening to the show, I immediately bought the book on Audible. I just finished it today. It was so helpful. I have friends with girls who are just entering late elementary and early middle school age, and I've shared this recommendation with them. It was a brave choice to make this episode, and I just want to take a moment to thank you for being willing to take the risk. I think that was one of Abigail's points is when you look at how this phenomenon, and let's be clear for those who didn't listen to that episode that we're not talking about transgenderism in general, but we're talking about this sudden phenomenon among young women, teen girls, who had exhibited no signs of gender dysphoria, to suddenly want to become boys. And not just want to become boys, but start taking hormonal medications, puberty blockers, even go as far as having double mastectomies at age 15 and 16 in the belief that they were boys. And it's new and it's sudden, and it seems to affect peer groups, sort of like little contagions like that, and you can see it on where it's happening, that once one girl gets it, other girls get it around her. So thank you, Renee. I urge everyone to buy Abigail's book. The book is called Irreversible Damage, The Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters. Okay, next one. Yes, also on the episode with Abigail, from Lana. Lana, good to hear from you again. Came through our email. Really glad you did this episode. I think I will need to look up the book, although the subject matter is exceedingly uncomfortable for me. I was a tomboy as a kid in an all-girls school, and as an adult, I'm frequently the only woman in the room. I'm an engineer who studied jiu-jitsu for years. I rarely noticed or minded, and it certainly never occurred to me that I might not be a woman. I'm horrified at the idea of an adolescent forced to grapple with that question due to enforced gender stereotypes. I was in my 20s before I even looked at porn for the first time. It made me nauseous for a week. Of course, I went back for more, but was unable to find anything remotely woman-friendly that wasn't behind a paywall. I can't imagine seeing that as a teen and going to a co-ed school knowing that the guys in your class were looking at the same stuff and then at you. Who wouldn't want to cut off their breasts and hide behind androgyny? That was one of the points that came up with our episode on sexual obsession with Daphne Merkin, where it was revealed to us. Just remember, I guess we're kind of basic or naive or old-fashioned, but that choking was kind of the new foreplay. I had never even known this. And since we talked about it on the program, that on Facebook and other places, people are making us aware, like, it's like a base now. And it's not clear, though, that, imagine a woman liking this. It's hard to imagine a man wanting to do it to a woman. And apparently it's often a man will just suddenly try and do it on a woman, even though, it's because he assumes that this is something that you just now do. I mean, if somebody tried that to me, I would think they were a serial killer, but apparently not. So we had a couple reactions. One said, actually, we had several, and they all, I think I'm going to take, it's BT Davis 27 on Instagram, who wrote on Choking. He sort of summed it up for everybody. This is just weird to me. I guess my girlfriend and exes just aren't kinky because no one has ever asked me to strangle them, even playfully, and I wouldn't do it if asked. To each their own, though. And also, we talked about Ronan Farrow, Mia Farrow, Woody Allen, the whole mess that whole family relationships seem to be. And Daphne Merkin, who had known both Woody Allen and Mia Farrow for a long time, had some kind of shocking revelations that she talked about on the program. So we heard from Adrian on Facebook. He said, Ronan Farrow's articles are a great read. His investigative journalism is superb, but he's as human as the rest of us with all the same failings. I'm also not taken in by the heroic narrative he's managed to build around himself, not because I doubt his sincerity or the hardships he faced, but only because we are all the heroes of our own story. Okay, now moving to the questions about Christina. So I have a funny one and a sweet one, and I'll read the sweet one first. It says, my name is Noah, and I'm 24 years old, a female. It's not too obvious if you don't know Israeli names, a longtime fan. First, I want to say I love the show, and I'm so happy you guys exist. I think what you're doing is very important, and you're setting up an example for open and honest conversations at a time when it's really needed. Fortunately, the silencing wokeness culture is not as strong in Israel as in the US, and I thought you should know that millennials are different in other countries. Well, that's great to hear, Noah. I'm writing to you because I was really sad to hear that Christina decided to retire. I think you both are great together and so entertaining. I love listening to your chats and laughing with you. Anyway, I just wanted to say I hope you and Christina are still good friends and that she didn't leave because you had a fight or something. I always tell myself that I'd be lucky to have a friend like you two as I get older. Noah, that's so sweet. Thank you. I'll answer that in a second after I read this other one. Came from Mark on Facebook, he said, I wonder if Christina got axed because she was too honest. In pursuit of truth, she was always pushing the envelope and didn't give a damn about political correctness. That kind of talk is dangerous these days. Danielle is a control freak. Christina is a loose cannon. That's why the podcast was so good. Maybe the control freak couldn't handle the stress. I hate to tell you this, Mark. Christina wasn't canceled, and it is really true. I'm a control freak. I just in my defense, though, there would not be a podcast if I were not such a control freak. But no, Christina really genuinely decided to retire. We've been doing the podcast for 2 years. A lot goes into it every week. And I think it was preventing her from doing other things that she wanted to do. And I'm very sad, and we're very sad to lose her. She's got a standing invitation to rejoin whenever she wants or if there's a guest. So she knows that. We miss her. But I also think it's important. I didn't want to stop the show myself. I'm sorry you have to put up with just me, especially for the time being. I mentioned on a previous episode that coming in the fall, we're going to have roll out a whole new cool, fabulous, rotating co-splainers. So we'll return to some of that banter and fun stories up the top that I haven't been able to do on my own. And actually, even when Christina was still here and COVID was hitting and all these terrible things were happening, both of us found it seemed a little, callous or crass to be making these, light things up top. And maybe we need that now more than ever. So we'll definitely be returning to that kind of format. As I said, I hope Christina does join us occasionally, but there is nothing more sinister than that. All right, I don't know what to make of this last email we received. I'd like your help. Help us decide what to do with this. So it says, "Hi, Danielle. I am one of the most eligible 32-year-old bachelors in your audience, and I'd like your help finding a gal. Please let me explain. I'm a longtime enjoyer of the podcast. Some of my favorite content is when you talk with David Frum about relationships. Oh, thank you. I share your values, and I find your vision for good relationships so compelling. I admire the way you two speak about each other. It's no secret the two of you are happy together." Again, thank you. At 27, I married a gal who was very impressive on paper. She was the second serious relationship I'd been in, and I was her first serious relationship. A year into the marriage, things took a very surprising turn. At 30, I initiated divorce, no kids. There was a lot of backstory, but I'll spare you. I've worked hard to process what happened with my ex, to learn critical lessons, and to come out better on the other side. I'm now 32 and looking to find a like-minded gal to start a family with. I know this is a long shot, but can you help me find a lady? Best regards, Blair from Seattle. And he notes that he has a master's degree, he's employed, he has a family-friendly career that he says, I really like, good with kids, 6'4", athletic, fit, emotionally mature, thoughtful, kind, intellectually curious and open-minded, love playing and listening to music. Okay, listeners, can we help Blair? I suggested he send us a photo and maybe we put him up on Instagram or Facebook and let's get the, femsplainer to mansplainer, mansplainer to femsplainer dating app going. Do you guys agree? Should we do this? Help find Blair a gal. So I'll follow us on social. Instagram is Femsplainers Podcast, and Facebook is at Femsplainers, and we'll see what we can do for Blair. And if you like this idea, we'll keep doing it. Send in your dating profiles. Anyway, that's it for this week. Thanks so much for staying with us and with me, and see you next week.